Chair, we're being live streamed, so if you want to start.
Okay, thanks very much. Good to see you all again, even though it's only been a fortnight since we last met, which is quite a short time for our committee, but here we are again. This, I need to remind us all, is an informal meeting because we are doing it on Zoom, but it's got the same force as though we were all sitting in the council chamber. And recommendations that we may make tonight will go forward to the Cabinet and be treated with the same seriousness as though it was a formal meeting, just to remind us of that. As you know, we're very keen to have as much public participation as possible, which means I hope some people might actually be looking at YouTube tonight. We have had 2 emails in, both from impressive organisations, CPRE and Need for Greed. Need for Greed? Need, yes, Need Not Greed. And they'll both have been sent to you, and hopefully you'll have had time to have a look at them before this meeting. We've also got 2 people here tonight who are on your screens. And I'd like to take them first, and then after apologies and declarations of interest, I'd like to move straight to the Oxfordshire Plan, returning to the rest of the agenda afterwards. I need your agreement to this, so if you could wave or put your fingers up if you agree. That looks like a reasonable number of people agreeing. That's fine, thanks very much. So if I can introduce our 2 speakers, we have Suzanne Mciver, who is the chair of the Cherwell Development Watch Alliance, and we have Andrew Gant, who needs no introduction in that he was the chair of Scrutiny for 5 years until May. And I think Suzanne will be speaking to us first. So over to you, Suzanne.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, my name is Suzanne Mciver, and tonight I'm here on behalf of Need Not Greed Oxfordshire, which has thousands of members across the county. I'd like to talk to you about the report that you have before you, which summarises the responses to the recent Oxfordshire Plan 2050 consultation. You may remember that back last summer, a very long draft consultation document was put before scrutiny panels of all the local authorities, but they were told that no changes could be made because time didn't allow. Need Not Greed has been in correspondence with the future Oxfordshire Partnership regarding this lack of proper scrutiny, but it seems we have the same situation again. You've been given a hefty report with little time to read it, and you're asked to just note its contents. We don't think this is actually scrutiny as it should be, and we have serious concerns about this report and about the officer's summary that's been put before you. You're busy people, you have a lot of documents to read, so you'll probably have turned to the officer's report and his summary of the key points in section 1.4. But if you've done that, you've been given a false impression of the consultation responses, and one that could have been written by a developer rather than a member of the Oxfordshire Plan team. As an example, many local groups representing thousands of residents have called for a review of the Oxfordshire Growth Needs Assessment. However, this has not even been mentioned in the officer's summary of key findings. The officer also makes a statement that there's a strong appetite to undertake a comprehensive review of the Oxford Greenbelt. This statement is a completely misleading representation of the responses. We're so concerned about the officer's key points that we're raising a formal complaint with the future Oxfordshire Partnership. Moving on to the views of how Oxfordshire residents are represented, last summer's Regulation 18 consultation document was long and technical, and not something that most people feel able to deal with. So it's left to local groups like us to respond on their behalf, not that we're in any way experts. Yet there's no acknowledgement in the consultation report that the local groups represent thousands of residents. This means that the views of Oxfordshire residents are not being heard, and the views of promoters and developers are being given more weight than they should be. This needs to change. Need Not Greed has been asking for some time how the key decisions on the Oxfordshire Plan are going to be taken. The most fundamental decision is the number of houses to be built. This will be between 16,000 and 67,000 on top of the 100,000 houses already committed to in Oxfordshire. So who's going to decide and when? The officer's report includes the words next steps in the title. But having read it, we're no nearer understanding who's going to make this decision or when. At this stage, this isn't good enough. We're told that the future Oxfordshire Partnership is not a decision-making body. So it's clear to us that the decision on the number of houses to be built must be made by each of the councils in turn with proper scrutiny. We want you, the councillors, to be in charge of this decision, but we also want our views as residents to be given a fair hearing. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. There may be some questions from the councillors here, but I think that's easiest to do at the end of Andrew's speech.
Could I, before Andrew does speak, sorry, Andrew, could I, before he does, just clear up one thing? Scrutiny actually is not being asked simply to note this report. It is actually able to make recommendations to Cabinet. That's my error for not picking that up. So don't feel that you're simply being asked to note this. You can make recommendations to Cabinet on it and to take forward anything that you think needs to be done.
Right, thank you, Tom. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Just to be clear, I'm speaking in my capacity as a member of Oxford City Council. Suzanne has raised broadly two very important points about this process. The first was around the consultation, which informs the paper that is in front of you this evening. I don't intend to comment about that, but I would certainly back up her request that this committee critiques that consultation and the interpretation placed on the results very carefully. It is, of course, an issue that this committee has looked at many times in the past, is exactly how it engages with the public, or how councils engage with the public, and what they do with the responses, and it is a very important question. The second point is the one that I would like to visit, and this concerns the process of deciding the text of the Oxfordshire Plan 2050. And this is, of course, a process which is emerging. But the text will go out for the regulation, statutory regulation 19 consultation, probably around the middle of this year. Before that, it will have been the subject of a vote at each of the 5 planning authorities, the 4 districts and the City Council in Oxfordshire, who will, of course, have to agree a common text. One of the features of that text will be that it will include a choice among the scenarios for growth set out in one of the key supporting evidence documents of that plan, the Oxfordshire Growth Needs Assessment, which is a very long, complicated and technical document. But that choice sets out the vision for growth for our county beyond that which is already factored into the current suite of local plans. It could hardly be more important for our vision of our county and how we see its future and how we factor our priorities into it. So it is absolutely essential that councillors and the public are fully involved in the development of that text before it gets to the vote at councils. This committee and its equivalents in the other district councils are absolutely crucial to that process. I was very pleased to hear your excellent scrutiny officer clarifying that this committee has indeed the full authority to make representations about the text at this meeting. However, this has not been on the agenda very long. Indeed, the text hasn't existed very long. So my ask to this scrutiny committee this evening is please assure yourselves that you have had full sight of the evidence base behind that decision and behind the text and behind the choice of a growth scenario. If you believe that you can do that this evening and make substantive recommendations about that, then please do. My instinct is that this has not been given enough notice, and I would ask you to consider bringing it back to the Scrutiny Committee at a future meeting in order to critique and examine that evidence base and to make recommendations as you see fit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Suzanne. That's very clear and very helpful. I don't know if any of the members of the committee have got questions that they'd like to pose to Suzanne or Andrew at this stage. I'm not seeing any. Alice, if you see any hands raised, do tell me, because I might miss them, but I can't see any. Okay, so that being the case, I think we can say thank you to Suzanne and Andrew. Suzanne may be staying on. Andrew, I think, has another committee to go to. And we now need to move on. What I'd like to do is to take apologies and declarations of interest and then go straight into the Oxfordshire Plan, because I'm very aware that we've got Alex Hollingsworth, Rachel Williams and Philip Wadsworth all here waiting to present, and I don't want to hold them up more than we have to. But I need your agreement before we do that. Are you happy for us to go ahead on that basis and leave the other items further down the agenda? Great, super. Right, okay. You've already been told that we are in a position where we can make recommendations tonight. It's also been suggested by one of our speakers, at least, Andrew Gant, that we may need more time to consider recommendations that we want to make, and that this might mean bringing the Oxfordshire Plan back to our next meeting, which is at the beginning of March. I think it's the 7th of March, Tom, isn't it? Okay, so can we bear in mind that we have as much time as we need? We are the Scrutiny Committee. We are one of the 5 Scrutiny Committees, and we are vital to get this right, because if we don't get it right, then the other people of Oxfordshire are going to suffer from our failures for the next 30 odd years, okay? So it's pretty serious stuff. So having said that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Alex, Rachel and Philip. I don't know which of you will be presenting. I can see your hand is up, Alex.
Yes, I probably ought to explain the slightly odd, unusual position that I'm in here. Normally when I come as a cabinet member with a cabinet report, it's because I've seen that report, I'm familiar with it, and it's my report. That's not the case for this report, and nor is it the case for any of my equivalents in any of the other cabinets across the county. On this, it's not mine. I'm not speaking for it, so I'm happy to kind of field questions and make comments as appropriate. Couple of sort of introductory comments. I think one, after the Scrutiny Committee, which I came to back in the summer on the Regulation 18 consultation, I went back to the subgroup of the not Growth Board anymore, the Future Oxfordshire Partnership, which is working on the 2050 plan, and I made clear my view that the timetable needed to take into account scrutiny committees having meaningful input before final drafts were put together. So I am pleased that the words I think I put into your mouths, which was one of your recommendations, I think they were my words in the end, have been picked up across the county and have been used in this way. And yes, you must look at this report, which looks at the consultation, so to some extent it's a backwards looking report, and you must also, I think, look at the emerging, or whatever one calls it, Regulation 19 document before it is at a point where it's in its 99% ready final draft, and an alteration in one council is going to cause chaos across all the others. So whatever that timing is, and I'll rely on Philip, I think, to explain what that timing is, because he's the person closest to it. But I think that's absolutely essential. That is your role, just as it is the role of every other scrutiny committee in the other 4 councils across the county. So completely back what was said earlier, and indeed I've delivered it to some extent. So I'm pleased about that. On the on the documents itself. As I said, very happy to express personal views on things. I'm not speaking for the other 4 cabinet leads, let alone the cabinets and their councils. I can answer questions about what the range of views might be on things, and so on, and I can express personal views, and I'm very happy to do that. So that's where we stand. And obviously, anything technical, either Rachel or Philip will pick up. I hope that's helpful, Chair.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Alex. I've just got one question really on the comment that you made, which is that this isn't your report, and I understand that. It's a report on the consultation feedback, isn't it, in effect?
Yes, that's correct. What would normally happen under our constitution is a report for cabinet I would have seen and signed off before it went to scrutiny. So I would take ownership of it. In this case, none of us have seen or signed off on this. I'm not saying I disavow it. It's just a slightly different setup to normal.
Right. Okay. And what we haven't got in the report is a complete breakdown of who said what in terms of their responses, in terms of their feedback. What we have is a general statement by the officer making the report as to what the feedback consisted of. Is that correct? I just need to get that clear in my own
mind.
Well,
I think you can get a technical answer, and I'll give you the political, a personal and small p, maybe large p political answer first, which is consultation on a local plan is not a referendum. If you look at the range of people who respond to these sorts of plans, they are profoundly unrepresentative of the demography of a county as broad as Oxfordshire. It is up to the people, whether it's a local plan, a neighbourhood plan, or whether it's, in this case, a different sort of plan for the entire county, to reflect on the different views expressed and what weight to give to them. But I think a numerical breakdown, I would suggest, is an unhelpful way of looking at it. We have elections for votes. This is not an election.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel, I think you want to say something.
If it would help, I could give a bit more background to what's in the report, what's before you.
Would you like to do that now?
Yeah.
Would you like to give that? Yes, fine. If you're happy to do that. I know that Nigel is going to ask a question. Would you like to ask your question first, Nigel, before Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to be clear on where the traction points are influencing the final recommendations. So we have a backward report here about consultation. Then there's going to be another round of consultation. And then I guess as a result of that consultation, there will be proposals. And then normally in life, then, the cabinet member, if you were talking the district council way, would draw up a set of ideas, and then they would come to scrutiny, and scrutiny would critique them, and then they'd feed back, and then the cabinet member would decide whether he or she wished to accept those proposals. Now, what's the equivalent here about when scrutiny would see, as it were, a further refined piece of work which would enable us to have any input? Because I'm a bit wary about, frankly, opining on some of this at the moment. A, because it's on the last minute, and B, we are only halfway through the consultation exercise in effect, because there's a whole new round of consultation about to start. So I feel I'm consultating on something which hasn't yet been, as it were, finished its process, never mind as it's been finalised in its formulation. You see what I'm driving at? So I'm finding it quite difficult, to be honest. So maybe you might be able to help me with the process points and the traction points.
Right, over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's a lengthy process to deliver a development plan, and particularly I'd say on the scale that we're talking about for Oxfordshire Plan, with a longer time frame, the more complexities, the difficult governance arrangements. It's a long process. So let me just explain where we've got to now, and then what's coming up next. So the last time I came to your committee, sorry, I was going to introduce myself to start with. Rachel Williams, Planning Policy and Place Manager, for those of you that don't remember. The last time I was before your committee was in July last year, and what you had before you at that time was called the Regulation 18 Part 2 document. Now, that document set out all the various options for policies for the Oxfordshire Plan that had been identified. So they weren't draft policies, they were a range of options that could be taken forward as policies. Now, at that time, I hear your concern. That report came to you just ahead of it going to Cabinet for approval, and there were limited opportunities to make changes to that document at that point. However, we did hear the comments that you've raised on various options contained in that document, and they were minuted, and I've checked and I've gone back through and identified that those were part of the City Council's response as part of the consultation. They were submitted to the Oxfordshire Plan team, and in fact there are several examples through the report that's before you today of where your concerns were raised and noted at the appropriate places. I can touch on some of those later if that helps. The next formal stage to develop the Oxfordshire Plan will be to refine those options, and that a series of different tasks are involved in that. So listening to what was said at the last round of consultation is important. Building up the evidence base and testing what's practical, feasible, deliverable, sound in all sorts of measures. And then selecting from within those options that you saw last time, some draft policies that will be in the next stage document. Now, that next stage document will come to you again in time as a full draft of what we would like to consult on for the Regulation 19 consultation. At that stage, in that meeting, we would be looking for you to consider that draft, make recommendations to Cabinet, Cabinet approve, it goes out for consultation. So that's that next step. However, we've heard, there's perfectly valid request for additional input into the process. And that's partly the reason for this report today. So what you have in front of you is a report of the last consultation, so you can see your comments reflected back, you can hear what other people saw, you can look at what that means for the options that were consulted on, and we can have a conversation about those if that's appropriate for you today. We will also look at additional opportunities for you to get involved between the Regulation 18 and Regulation 19. And we'll be guided a little by you about from your work programme and at what stage you'd like to get involved in that. But we would very much welcome everybody's input into that work as it develops between the stages. And I think it's wholly appropriate to have another meaningful conversation about which options are selected to be taken forward as draft policies before we get to that meeting ahead of a Cabinet approval for consultation. I think that's appropriate, and we can work that into the programme. I hope that works as a sort of summary of where we've got to.
I've got various questions coming up on the screen, Rachel. Do you want to answer them now? This is probably quite a good moment because you've been through the process, which is very helpful. Okay. We've got Chris, and then Linda, Dick, and then Adrian. In that order. Okay. So Chris first.
Can you clarify what's the process at the end of the day? Presumably there must come a point where all 5 districts have to approve the plan or not approve the plan. In the event that one of the districts were to not approve the plan, is it the case that that one district would cause the entire plan to fall? And if so, then is that the point where Scrutiny and this council in general actually really have their traction? And until then, their advice might be taken quite lightly, but at that final point, it obviously would have great impact if that understanding is correct.
Okay, thank you for that question. This is a complexity of this plan. It's different than producing a normal local plan because we do need each of the 5 districts to approve the contents at each stage in the process, and then with the final draft, that's the case. of course, we're all hoping that we can find a set of policy approaches that all 5 districts can approve of and can approve in their own cabinets to make sure that we've got a set of sound policies across the county. We wouldn't try to bring a draft plan that we felt you couldn't support. Because that would add complexity in terms of it being approved by all the other districts as well. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, every district has it in their gift to not support what's in the draft plan. That's the case. It would be your contribution to the Oxfordshire Plan. I'd like to think we won't get to that point, and that's why the input of your committee and other committees along the way to make sure that we get a set of policies that we can all approve is really important. But it is your decision it is the City Council's decision to make at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. Right, Linda, your question.
Thank you. I've got 3 areas really that I'd like to raise where I think, depending on what we hear back tonight, perhaps we should make recommendations to the Cabinet for them to go away and attempt to negotiate with the other districts to make changes. The first one is about sewage pollution and wastewater. I don't think the document's very strong on that at the moment, and I'd like to be more reassured about how the Thames Water's investment plans, future investment plans, can align with the plans for growth, and how we work with them closer to make sure that happens and sync that up. The second area is about leisure, recreation and open space. I see that there is an alternative policy option floated in the report to protect parks, play areas, sports areas, and I think that is something we should support. I think with increasing the density of housing in urban areas, these spaces become increasingly important, and I think what's going on at the moment at Sandy Lane, at Bertie Park and other areas just goes to show that a policy like this is needed at a strategic level, and that we should try and get blanket protection for parks, play areas, playing fields, which are in public use, and local nature reserves. And finally, this is floated as a possible policy option in the report as well, but doesn't seem to be taken up at the moment, and that's about the importance of efforts to reduce inequality and deprivation. See, it is referred to throughout the report in passing, but I would really like to see that as a strong policy in its own right in the document. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are we looking towards recommendations later on those points you've raised, Linda?
Well, let's hear what everyone's got to say first. It could be, that we're told, yes, that's, you don't need to worry about that, and then we could make a judgment about what we need to recommend.
Fine. If you can just hold them in your mind, that's good. Dick, your question.
Thank you, Liz. I've jumped in a bit too early because I see you're on questions, so I'm not going to ask a question. But I'll take the opportunity just to flag up that I do have a recommendation to bring, which deals with some of the things, the very top level things that have been mentioned both by Rachel and by Alex about the process. I think in some major respects, the consultation report we've got is not fit for purpose, and I think there's a bit more that's needed before those on the inside of the process may know the answers to some of the questions that I'm wanting to ask, but I think the general public is not going to learn very much actually from that consultation report, and I've got a recommendation to bring about that. So it's a very high level. It doesn't go into specifics at all. It's more about process. Thanks.
Right, thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Rachel, at this point, or would you like to wait and
So the purpose of the consultation report, which is Appendix 1 of this report, is to provide a summary of all the representations that were made during that period. So there is no attempt in that report to apply any weighting or judgment to those reports. It's a factual report. It's good practice to, shortly after a consultation has been held, to produce this sort of report so that it's clear and transparent, the issues that have been raised and the issues that will be considered in taking forward the work itself. So the intention of that report is purely that. It's a factual summary of the representations that were made. There will be another stage of work, and that's where some reflection is done on what people said. So at the moment, you have a report that simply states people said these, made these comments. Of course, we need to reflect on that. The Oxfordshire Plan team will need to reflect on that, and they will need to go through those comments and work through what to do about them. So where to make changes, where to put in additional aspects to potential policies, for example, which of those policy options I mentioned to drop at this stage and which to continue with. So there's an additional stage of work that will need to be done in-house on that. As I say, what you have in front of you is intended to be a helpful stage where it's a factual reporting of the comments that were raised. I don't know if that helps address that point at all.
Yeah, thank you. I can see that Adrian's hand is lifted. Adrian, would you like to comment?
First off, Chairman, I need to apologise for getting in late to the meeting, but IT problems there. And a broad issue first to do with the involvement and opportunities going forward. I need to flag that was flagged up through the last process, and it is all partners' intention to make sure we don't fall into that trap again and need to build time, as Rachel indicated, that gives this process, which is so valuable to the credibility of the process, but also brings an extra quality to the output. So officers are aware of that and need to make sure we build it into the right timetable. It's just to give you assurance on that. The other bits that have come up that Linda was raised, I need to note what was raised. To do with the sewage side of things, there's two parts to it. There's the Thames Water investment side, and we will work with Thames Water. We do at a district level for our own local plan and need to build that into future needs and demands from the growth agendas that go forward. But there is an issue there that there's, I appreciate it is a high level topic at this moment in time, is the amount of pollution that is happening into the rivers. Some of that is outside of our control. That's a matter for Thames Water and the Environment Agency to deal with through their powers. It isn't a matter that local plan can deal with on that type of basis. It can plan for the future and the future growth, and the 2050 plan can bring a strategic policy in place to reinforce what you will have to do at the local plan level. And some of those basic principle of the high level policy gets then drilled down into the district local plan and deals with the detailed needs of what your area and your requirements are for your growth that happens on the ground. And that the same goes for the leisure and parks and etc. to what specific requirements. The strategic policy cannot cut across existing allocations and existing local plans, but it can set the theme for how you wish to add greater protection for those green spaces, etc., etc. And then the local plan will then take over that detail and what that means on the ground to how that takes forward. Hopefully that clarifies a bit of that for members.
Right, thank you very much. Alex, your hand's up, and then after Alex, Chris again, and then Hosni. Okay.
Yeah, it's a reflection. Some of this is a personal view, but I think this also based on observation of my fellow planning leads and indeed the leaders of the councils from having been at the Future Oxford Partnership meeting. The timescale on this process is quite tight. There's a finite amount of time left to take things forward. So that's pressure number one. The second pressure is no one else has done one of these before. So this Oxfordshire's councils are treading new ground here. One of the challenges is trying to understand how the planning inspectorate, so PINS, you'll hear that acronym quite a lot, how PINS will form a judgment on this. So with a local plan or a neighbourhood plan, a planning inspector will look in detail at the policies and they will use the tests which are in the NPPF's paragraph 35, which I'd really strongly recommend people look at, because it's stuff that's kind of crucial to how these are dealt with. And those are the 4 tests for any plan like this: that it be positively prepared, that it be justified, that it be effective, and that it be consistent with national policy. And probably the big test here is justified. Justified in this sense means, is there evidence to justify the policy? So if you were, for example, in a local plan saying that you want 50% of all developments to be affordable housing, which is the position in our current local plan, we have to produce one hell of a lot of evidence to stack that up. So the same tests are going to be applied by PINS to this plan, to the 2050 plan. So any policy that's in this has to be justified by evidence that can be produced. Now, clearly, and as Suzanne Mciver made clear, there's disputes about whether evidence says one thing or a different thing, and that's entirely fine. That's exactly the kind of things that go on at a local plan hearing, arguments over the evidence. The issue is producing a policy for which there is no evidence. So I'm going to use an entirely nonsensical one just to prove the point. If we put into this a policy which said the entirety of Oxfordshire should be a conservation area or something like that, that wouldn't be justified because there would be no evidence to support such an allocation. So with those two things in mind, the time pressure and the need to produce evidence, I think the view that I've expressed has found some support from other people, which is the Regulation 18 consultation was probably too many. There were too many policies. There was too much stuff that's trying to cover too many bases, and it would be better to focus in on essential strategic stuff and leave, as Adrian's just explained, the detailed stuff as it must do to local plans. And I think there is a risk of having a number of the policies which are in that consultation, because I'm not totally convinced that that we can produce the evidence to back it up, the policy suggestion. So I think that's a kind of a direction of travel issue. I do think that it would be helpful to hear the Scrutiny Committee's views on the housing numbers, and I think you might wish to reflect on the discrepancies between the housing trajectories and the identified need for affordable housing. I'm very happy to give you numbers on that later.
That would be helpful, I think. Can we hear from Chris and then from Hosni, and then we ought to get back to Rachel, because you've only just started with your report, and I'm aware that there's quite a lot more that you'll need to say about it before we ask you questions on the main report. Chris, you're next.
Just a brief question on reporting, and especially summarization of the report, and perhaps a recommendation on the back of that. But I'll ask the question and then see whether it still makes sense. So particularly in the 6-page summary that tries to sum the whole thing up, it describes getting 3,700 individual responses from 422 individuals and organizations. What's going on there in terms of that seem, I mean, are those individual responses individual questions, or is it really suggesting that there were on average just under 10 responses per individual? Or yeah, what's going on there? And also, how are those individuals and organizations breaking down into individuals, organizations, and I guess particularly also not-for-profit versus for-profit organizations?
Yeah, would you like to respond to that, Rachel?
Yeah. We're the respondents, or the number of people that have responded, and comments are the number of comments that they've collectively made. So for the purpose of summarising the comments, we've looked at each theme and how many comments were made on each theme. So as you would expect, a good number of the people that responded went through the whole document and gave a comment on each of the policy areas or themes that were identified, because we were seeking views on a whole range of issues. Other people will have jumped into the document at their pet issue and will have responded just on that. So we have a large number of individual comments, and individuals will have responded on either one or two or the whole document. So that's where the difference in numbers of comments and numbers of people come in. I believe at the beginning of Appendix 1, there is some analysis of who responded. So yes, chart 1, there's a little graph that shows whether they were, what type of organisation people were from, or whether they were responding on their own behalf as an individual. And then there's some further breakdowns of some of the headline figures. So age, where the people lived that were responding. And then I think helpfully a table that shows which themes attracted more comments than others. So there is some information there that I hope is helpful to you.
I see. Yes, I remember seeing that now. Unfortunately, I couldn't read the respondent type chart because it uses 5 different shades of brown, and I couldn't actually distinguish which one was which. So a very, very trivial point. If that could be represented as a table, that would help, especially if you're colorblind like I am. So I actually still don't know how many individuals responded compared to how many organizations.
Well, if it helps the meeting, I can extract that information into a table and send it after the meeting, if that's helpful.
Sure, that would be useful. So I suppose that, so the reason I bring it up, and the concern in general, and I don't know whether the committee would want to take this as a thing, is that even though we hear that this isn't a referendum, that this isn't straightforward sort of one person, one vote, and obviously if you are a developer Megacorp Inc., then your one vote counts really quite differently from if you are a private individual responding on their own behalf. But the text in Appendix 1 will frequently use forms of words along the lines of policy was broadly supported, or policy was widely supported, or something like that. And then immediately following from that will be the straightforward sort of one person, one vote summaries. So it seems like even if we are not, this isn't a referendum on a policy by policy basis, that the text frequently behaves as if it is. So it's, yes, it becomes increasingly clear as I say this that this isn't formulated as a recommendation, but hopefully you can see what I'm driving at there with regards to keeping away from that sort of referendum-like behaviour and treating these very, very different classes of respondent as if they are alike.
I can see that as a recommendation, actually, Chris. If
anybody could help me phrase that in a way which isn't about half a page of A4, that would be very useful.
I think I've tried to do that in my recommendation, Liz.
Oh, fine, good. Right. I think there was another question. Somebody's hand was raised. Yeah, I'm sorry, Hosni, it was you. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't realise I'd take. Can you hear me? I'm trying out the headset. Just a couple of, I guess one question about the consultation, so I probably should remember from the summer, and then one comment or kind of a broader question. So the question about the consultation is that if you actually read the text, there are things, for example, respondents were asked about the integrated care systems. And I'll be honest, I work in the NHS and I have no idea, a lot of people have no idea what the integrated care systems, how they're going to operate. So I do wonder how the respondents responded to the plans, considering that there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of unknown unknowns. So I'm talking about, for example, all the public services are really unknown, even things like water, sewage that we were just discussing, even that aspect of it is really unknown. So it does kind of bring into question, how can you comment on something when you don't really know what the environment in which you're going to be living in is going to be like? And was that explored at all at the consultation? I can't remember the details of the questions, but it does seem to me that unless you really know what environment you're talking about going into the future, it does raise the question of what are you actually answering. That's the first broader point and question, I guess, around the consultation. How was it managed, that aspect of it, the unknown factors? Because obviously this is the districts, but they don't, for example, have power over, how health policy is devised, for example, or how schooling policy is devised. So there's lots of unknowns. So that's one point. The second point I think I put in the chat, but I'll just repeat again, is around accountability. I think because I think people are always quite confused around accountability anyway, and it's quite opaque, and it's even more opaque now that we've got 5 different districts involved. You did describe the process, but for example, if this committee was really keen on a particular recommendation, and then that was brought to, went through the process that you spoke about, then who is effectively, is it that cabinet member that is responsible for making sure that they do everything they can to get that recommendation into the final plan? I guess that's just quite an important thing to be aware, be understanding how that works. I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that, Rachel?
Certainly. There are numerous routes for influencing the choice of policies for the plan. So Scrutiny Committee being one, formal recommendations being one of those. I myself sit on a number of officer working groups with my counterparts across the county, and we have conversations about future policy directions, for example. Adrian on the call meets regularly with the other heads of planning across the county, and they have similar conversations at a different level on a monthly basis. And as Councillor Hollingsworth mentioned, he's a member of the member subgroup of the Future Oxfordshire Partnership. Again, they meet monthly. All the cabinet members for planning meet monthly to have conversations on the same sort of themes. So what I'm trying to illustrate is there are a number of different mechanisms through which we can make sure that your views and your vision, your priorities are heard through this process. There are formal stages and lots of informal conversations that happen along the way. In terms of the future, policy plan making is always a delicate balance, because you never know everything. If you waited until everything became clear before you drafted a policy, you'd be waiting a very long time. What we have to do, of course, is gather the best available evidence at any time, keep that up to date, and ensure that when we start to design our policies, we have a good balance between the kind of prescriptive end of a policy and a flexible end of a policy. We need to strike a right balance between the two. Policies need to be strong and have teeth in order to deliver what our objectives are, but there does need to be some flexibility to account for those unknowns, as you've suggested. We can never be absolutely certain what Oxford or Oxfordshire will look like at a set point in the future.
Sorry to interrupt, just a quick question. Do you have any power over the other bodies such as CCG? That was kind of what I was getting at with the public. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have a duty to cooperate with a number of statutory agencies and bodies. We have a duty to cooperate with our neighbours around Oxfordshire and across the Oxfordshire border. We work closely with a whole range of stakeholders, service providers, people that provide services and facilities across the county. We need to make sure that the plan policies take account of their own corporate plans and objectives. So with the best will in the world, for example, there would be no point in having a planning policy that commits a certain body in the NHS to a certain approach in the future if that's not their intention. We can have conversations to help us identify what the issues that are likely to arise are going to be. We can help to influence organisations' plans for the future, their corporate and strategic, their estates planning, for example. And then we need to find a way of drawing up planning policies that, as I say, try to take the best balance we can and allow some flexibility for the unknowns. There's a bit of an art to it. A lot of it is about relationship building. So making sure that the right people are involved at the right stages all the way through the process.
Well, thanks very much. I'm going to ask Alex and Adrian to make their points, their hands raised. But before I do that, I should mention that we're not meant to be putting stuff in the chat. And the reason for that is that doesn't come up on the live stream. So, unless it's a technical thing like, I'll let you lose your Zoom or whatever, don't put it in the chat. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Right, Alex, you'd like to comment?
Yes, just on two points that kind of emerge from the conversation. On the what happens to a scrutiny recommendation, I mean, I would say, as the cabinet member, that if scrutiny committee makes a recommendation with which I agree, and therefore the cabinet accepts, I will do everything in my power to ensure that it's delivered. That might not be possible because of the veto power that the other four councils have, but I will do my best. If it is a recommendation that I do not agree with, so in the normal run of things that occasionally happens, then clearly, I won't be trying to implement it, but you'll know why, because I'll explain in my response to your recommendation why it is that I don't agree with it. And then it's up to council to hold me to account for whether I should have done that or not. So that's the normal run of things. On this sort of issue, and I'm going to use the CCG as the example because I think lots of us are familiar with it, and certainly members of my group and indeed council have heard me griping about this at some length. The CCG, which is about to disappear into ICS brackets, Bob close brackets, the integrated care system that Hosnia just referred to, basically has never produced any kind of meaningful primary care estates strategy for the city, or indeed for anywhere else in Oxfordshire. It produced quite late in the day a document which lists all the leases for GP surgeries and some sort of suggestion that dealing with the ones that are in inadequate buildings would be good. But it hasn't gone to the next stage of saying how it would go about doing that using its priorities, how it wants to organise primary care services and so on. And the same kind of critique, I think, can rightly be made of Thames Water. And as Rachel said, as a planning authority and the other planning authorities, we're kind of stuck when a statutory consultee doesn't do its bit. It's very difficult. We can't put policies in saying, put GP surgeries here, here and here, if there isn't a document saying that the CCG wants GP surgeries here, here and here. What I think would be worth exploring at the strategic level is saying that, using the primary care policy, that there should be a clearly identified set of strategic objectives for where primary care needs exist, what new facilities are required, where they should be sited, and how they should be co-located with other primary care services. And therefore, at a strategic level, putting a requirement that then has to be carried out at the local plan level to ensure that such a strategy is produced as part of the evidence for the local plan. So it's using the strategic level to say that such a strategy is required, and then relying on the local plans to ensure that it's delivered. And that seems to me to sort of like get a quite good halfway house between the situation we currently have of there just not being the cooperation from people like the CCG, or the cooperation, non-delivery, I think is probably the The word is probably better to use, and getting into a position where at a strategic plan we try and over specify something and not have the evidence for it. And that seems to me to be actually using a strategic plan in the way in which it was intended. As I said, that's a personal view. I appreciate Adrian's going after me. You may well shoot it down, but that seems to me sort of like, you know, using the strategic plan for the purpose for which it was intended, to identify, somebody said, Hosnier, I think, said, you know, the unknown unknowns and the unknown unknowns. This is a known unknown. I think we should be identifying it, highlighting it, and requiring that it should become a known before new local plans are pulled together under the aegis of this strategic plan.
Thank you, Alex. Adrian, would you like to shoot down what Alex has just said? I think he's invited you to do that.
Just the opposite, Chair. I was going to come to that position that 2 points. One, it is picking up on the flexibility that Rachel touched on, and the need to potentially have high-level policies that have that flexibility, and strategies are the key part of that, requiring a strategic approach. Just to bring some confidence to it, there is an ongoing dialogue with the NHS and the care system, because we're well aware of it's in a bit of flux at the moment, and that's going to require a fair bit of effort to encourage them to move their positioning and their approach along that much quicker, so it can fit to this timetable. So the policy that does get put into the 2050 plan has a bit more credibility. But most of all, the critical bit to it is the evidence to support it. Because without the evidence, as we've already touched on, then the wording will have to be diluted and less about it. It becomes more about the language that you try and use, and therefore it's then difficult to take it much further. The more evidence, the more strategic, the more specific it starts to become, then it falls down to the district level, as Alex touched on, to what facilities where becomes a lot easier to achieve and deliver on the ground going forward.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I've got a couple of questions, and then I think we need to go back to Rachel to give her a chance to actually hear from her what she was going to talk about this evening, as opposed to the process. But just a couple of questions. One is that I find it very difficult reading this document because the policies are very high level, and I hadn't realised that effectively they are the top layer, and underneath them there will be a strategic level, and below them will be the local plans, and below them, I suppose, the neighbourhood plans. And so it goes on down. And so that's very useful. But I wonder how we can move from Reg 18 to Reg 19. The concern I've got is that you're now refining the options, but it's not clear to me that we've got enough evidence base at the moment to refine those options. It's partly because the language is really quite opaque. Can I read you something that I wrote down because I didn't understand it? This is 45116 about urban renewal. An aspirational housing target might mean that urban renewal may not be the preferred option, as it would concentrate on areas of Oxford and possibly overlook other opportunities. That gets me absolutely nowhere. And I think that must be the case for quite a lot of people reading this, is that it's very opaque. And that means that I don't know what the options are. And I don't know if you're going to be selecting one option after collecting more evidence to put into Reg 19. But at the moment, it's very difficult for me to comment. And that's just me, that's my personal view. But I'm also concerned that we don't know what other evidence is going to be collected before the Reg 19 draft is actually prepared. You'll have heard Suzanne Mciver talking at length about the Ogner review and seeking an independent review because she and quite a lot of the non-commercial organisations, community groups, aren't happy about it. We don't know the numbers because it hasn't been possible so far to actually separate the opinions of the developers from the opinions of the non-profit organisations, which is again a concern to me, is that developers are probably more efficient and more able at making comments than many individuals or indeed small organisations are. So that's a worry. But what sort of evidence are you going to be collating? Should we know that? You obviously feel that there are gaps in the evidence which need to be filled before you move to Reg 19, but we don't know what you see as those gaps. So those are my questions, but don't answer them now. You carry on with what you want to say. Although we have questions from Dick and from Nigel. I don't know if you want to bring them in now or let Rachel continue.
I think we should let Rachel continue, but she may answer the question. All right, so let her continue.
Dick, how about you?
It may be that my question is going to be answered in what Rachel says, in which case I might as well ask it. You know what I mean? Because I think it could be incorporated in what you're saying.
Okay, fine.
It's actually a fairly simple question, actually, if I might. Okay, so we've got this document. It's a consultation report. I haven't really got in my mind much of a clear picture as to what status the consultation itself has in the whole process, and in particular what the status of this particular report has. I mean, does it have any clout at all, or is it, you know, I'm sure it isn't this, but, you know, well, we've done the consultation, we've got the report, we can now put it in the bin and forget about it and get on with the real job, because we, the planning officers involved in all of this, know what that consultation, we were deeply involved. The Scrutiny Committee wasn't, the public even less. So I'm very unclear actually what the status of this report, which I've chewed through, it took me 2 days to do it, what its status is, whether this report that we've got is supposed to be some kind of working document for you and your team as you go forward and decide, you know, where there's need for further evidence or that kind of stuff. So as you sort of move on, I mean, just give me some clue as to how beholden to this report that we've been presented with you are to that.
Okay, thank you. Nigel, your hand is still up. Do you want to come in now?
No, I'd like to wait, please, if I could.
Of course. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Just to come back on those questions then, what evidence is still needed? I think both Adrian and Alex touched on the weight of evidence that's needed to support a policy. The draft plan will go in time before a planning inspector, and the planning inspector will hear objectors that don't like the draft plan, and they will test the evidence that we've provided to support it. So all of that will happen in a public forum in due course. The onus is on ourselves as the partners in this project to provide the evidence to support those policies. Now, it's perfectly normal that through the kind of protracted process, as I've explained, to develop a plan, the evidence gets better and deeper and of more quality, more detail as the work continues. Now, we've thought it's important and good practice to publish the evidence base such that it's developing at each stage a consultation is published. So when the consultation document was published in the summer, alongside it were a number of evidence-based reports that we felt were helpful to be out there in the public to help explain why we'd selected the options that we were consulting on, and gave a bit of background and extra detail, extra analysis, facts and figures to help people consider which of the options they favoured in their responses. So at each stage, we publish a consultation document. We will also publish alongside it all the available evidence that's there to help that process. Now, that's not to say that all the pieces of evidence-based work that were published last time will are fixed in stone. We need to come back and make sure that as the programme develops, the best available evidence, that's a planning phrase I keep using, I hear myself saying it, the best available evidence at each stage is used to inform the process. So there are a number of issues where we believe the Oxfordshire Plan needs to commission or carry out some additional analysis. So for example, off the top of my head, I can think of some work on the Greenbelt, some work on areas of flood risk. There's a whole range of different topics where we know in order to support policies, we will need to provide those bits of evidence base. Now, they might come in lots of different forms. It's quite likely that some of those topics, for example, flood risk, each of the districts in Oxfordshire has got a good piece of work on flooding that we can patchwork together, update where appropriate, and that becomes the flooding evidence, for example, for the Oxfordshire Plan. There are other pieces of evidence where we will need to commission something new. So, for example, a Greenbelt review is something that you're likely to see at the next stage, published at the next stage, because that's an important piece of evidence base that we will need to compile to inform the work further. So there's a whole range of those studies that we will continue to keep up to date. There might be new, we're expecting a planning white paper at some point, there may be new topics that we need to consider that we haven't picked up as yet, and we'll need to keep developing and keep strengthening that evidence base. Second question about the status of this report. In due course, the planning inspector will expect a very detailed consultation report. They will need to see at what work was done at each stage of the process, who we reached, in what numbers, what methods we used, what people said, how we responded to what people said, importantly. And that piece of work will need to go to the planning inspector when we submit for examination. The report you've got before you today, so Appendix 1 of this report, is part of that. In time, it will become part of that consultation report that's part of the examination. As I said earlier, there's an important piece of work for the Oxfordshire Plan team to do now, which is to reflect on what people said and explain in time what we did with those comments. So how those comments are reflected in the next stage of work. And that will be available in due course. So at each stage you will get a consultation report, and then in time they will all be incorporated into one consultation statement for the planning inspector. So I'm hoping that you find this summary of people's responses helpful as part of your reflection in terms of your recommendations and what you would like to see in the next stage of the Oxfordshire Plan. You might find it easier to work to assess this alongside the consultation document that was published in the summer, so you can see what was presented to the public and then what people said in response. That might be a helpful way to go through it. That's the status of the report. You might be glad to know I didn't have a lot of extra things I wanted to raise to the committee today. The consultation report, so Appendix 1, to me is the main item on this covering report. So the covering report also provides some update on scope, next steps, and talks about the statement of community involvement, which has been slightly revised, and we will be asking Cabinet to approve that. Statement of community involvement sets out how we will continue to engage with people as the process develops. There's some adaptations that are needed this time, because last time the consultation happened during the pandemic. Things will be different next time, and they can be much more in person. So that's the only other aspect of the covering report to touch on tonight. I think where committee can add value is by considering those policy options that were consulted on, reflect on what people said, responded to us on. And where you have recommendations for which of those options should be taken forward at the next stage and which ones shouldn't, making those clear to us as part of the consideration for the next stage of work.
Okay, thank you very much. We've now got questions from Nigel, from Linda, and from Adrian. Nigel, you've waited very patiently.
It's a mixture. I mean, I think we've heard enough now, really. Maybe we can move more on to comments than questions. I suppose for me, I mean, I just find the language of this document extremely opaque. And I think one of the problems we've got is a confusion about what they call policy options, which is a phrase used an awful lot. Most of the time, they are themes or areas of policy. They're not actually options, because no options are laid out. In some cases, you have a headline piece of language, then you have an A or a B. But in quite a few cases, you don't. So in the case of the Greenbelt example, there are no trade-offs being articulated there. There's just a sort of general sense of the Greenbelt's rather important and people feel differently about it. And we need to go away and think about it very hard. And we need to come up with some broad strategy about it. So I think that's one of the problems here. I think the document purports to be further down the road than it really is, because it's actually not laying out trade-offs or choices, except at a very high level and often not even that. So that's the first comment I have. The second comment I have is that, of course, that things are interlinked. So if you look at the three so-called options on housing numbers, they then have all sorts of knock-on effects, depending on which option you take. Because the notion that the Greenbelt wouldn't be affected if you went for the most ambitious housing number, that seems to me impossible, because there won't be enough brownfield sites around to deliver a transformational number. So you then have to think about how that would affect the Greenbelt. So it's really hard to come to a view about whether you should go for the minimum number of houses, the midpoint, or the transformational, because I don't know what the impact on other facets of life is going to be. Frankly, it's impossible to know that. So, that's why I'm struggling to give any sort of steers at this point. And maybe you're not really asking for steers; you're just asking for whether stuff should be broadly in the consultation proposal. The third area for me is, going back to Dick's point, there should be absolute clarity about the weighting given when policies are being proposed of the consultation process, which is clearly not the case at the moment. It's a very crude mechanism going on here, which is I had 5 answers, 3 were broadly in support, 2 were against, or whatever. But some of those could be organizations representing hundreds of people, some could be organization 1. So the weighting issue is really important at the next stage to have transparency, and that should be one of our recommendations, in my view. That should be absolutely clear. But I suppose my biggest point is it's about the interrelationship. It's about the knock-on effects of, if you decide, let's say, the pivotal issue about the number of houses built, or whether Oxford should be the centre of growth versus other parts of the county. Those are big questions, and they have profound knock-on effects into other policy areas. And so whichever way whoever's drafting this finally after the second round of consultation, they've got to connect up the knock-on effects. You see what I'm seeing, Liz? They've got to explain, because we went for this trade-off on this, there were trade-offs in other areas, such as infrastructure or environment or whatever. And that's clearly we're not at that point. And then you could come to a view as to whether you thought those trade-offs were good or not, and you could support them. But we're not at that point at the moment. So that's why I really can't. All I think we can do tonight is give a sense of, are there any big policy areas that are completely missing? To go back to what Linda was talking about earlier on. Can we ask for some better clarity about the interrelationships of policies? But that's about as far as I can go based on the evidence in front of me. I can't get into trade-offs because I don't have the evidence to make the trade-offs. I'm sorry not to be more helpful, but I think it's a really big point, this.
Thank you very much. Shall we take the questions from Linda and the comments from Adrian next, and then you come back, Rachel, because I'm aware of time. Linda.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think my 3 suggestions about recommendations that I made earlier still stand, but I'd like to weigh in on the subject of the consultation itself as well. So I mean, the report seems quite pleased with itself about the consultation, and I don't think it should be at all, actually. 422 respondents, and we can see from the pie chart that a quarter of those are from developers. Nearly another quarter from organisations, so that leaves roughly, just over 200 individuals responding. Well, that's not even as many councillors as we've got across the county. So it's interesting to see, it's great that the webinars were held and a focus group. I presume the numbers involved in those are included in the 422. So if that's so, then it's even worse than it looks. And given that money was spent on having a focus group, which if it was done, I'm sure it was done properly with a commercial firm that knows what it's doing, it would have been interesting actually to see the results of that in this report, because I would have given that some weight if that was conducted properly with a genuinely representative sample of Oxfordshire's population. But we don't have that information, which is a shame. Just finally, a question on the Greenbelt review. Can you tell us more about what the process of that actually looks like, and what will be the opportunities for public involvement in that review? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you like to answer that specific question from Linda now about Greenbelt? And then we'll go back to the other questions. Rachel? Okay.
So there is a set process for how to carry out a Greenbelt review. And when I say Greenbelt review, that doesn't necessarily mean a change to the Greenbelt. Sorry, it's one of the things of the English language. A Greenbelt review is to look at the Greenbelt, not stepping forwards to a decision to make any changes to that. So we do need to carry out a new updated assessment of the Greenbelt. We've done that previously collectively as Oxfordshire authorities. Since then, there have been some pieces of Greenbelt released for development, and so we do need to go back and review that piece of work. So it's a qualitative piece of work about the performance of parcels of Greenbelt against the government's list of purposes of the Greenbelt. So there is a set process for that. We collectively as partners will commission a consultant with expertise in this to carry that out on our behalf. The methodology behind that will, as I say, will follow that approved process for doing so. And as I mentioned earlier, each time we do have a piece of evidence base concluded, ready to be published, that will be published alongside others as they develop. So I'd say that the broad answer to the question is, when that piece of work has been completed, and as partners we will all be collective clients for that piece of work, we'll make sure that it's done properly and following guidance. That will be published, and the public will have a chance to comment on that and how we've interpreted its findings in the draft policies at the next stage of work.
Thank you. Right, Adrian, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to add to the bit to do with evidence, that there is a key part still to be done, and that is the viability side of things. Without the viability evidence, that is quite a key piece that underpins so much of the other evidence and how your policies get formulated. There is no point having a policy that is high in ambition, but in viability terms can never be delivered. So there is a balance between where that evidence and the viability evidence takes you. At each regular times in the next set of steps that we're going to be taking, officers will take key and quite specific legal advice on sort of things that are being developed in policy terms. To whether we need further evidence or whether that's going to stand that test of soundness and going to be able to jump through those various different hoops that was that was spoken about at the early stages. And the last bit, just to take on what Linda was indicating about, from her perspective, that the amount of respondents wasn't that good. I've taken a note of that, and all I would say is that we need to try and do better than we've done this time round. How we do it, I don't have the answer for that yet. That's where the different officers group are going to need to develop a further internal strategy to how we can do that better going forward, as Rachel touched on. Hopefully that helps.
Adrian, could you just sort of clarify what you mean by viability? That would help me anyhow.
Yes, it will be a financial viability appraisal that needs to be done. The scope of that I'll leave to the likes of other officers, but in principle what it is trying to achieve is I'll take on the easy one that is going to cause probably the biggest headaches, is the overall viability in value terms to do with housing numbers. Given the difference in values across the whole of Oxfordshire, how you translate that if you have a low ambition or high ambition of growth, you've got to be able to financially deliver that. If the values aren't there in what you're trying to achieve because of all the asks that you're putting on it through the other policies, that a site to deliver X thousands of houses is never going to be delivered because of all the other policies, then that's not going to be found sound. That's where that balance comes back into what Alex touched on earlier. There is a balance between where you want to take those strategic policies, how far you can go from a soundness basis, but also the evidence base to support it needs to get that right balance. And that also needs to reflect on all the other policies that we have in that document going forward. Is it the right blend? Is it the right degree? Is it the right detail to be able to get to something that's going to be approved by an inspector?
So can I just sort of give an example? So I totally understand what you're saying. I mean, if, for instance, it was decided to put 5,000 houses on an old airbase, for instance, but a long way from any economic activity or indeed transport or whatever, how would that work on a viability basis? I mean, there are so many elements, aren't there, that come into it. It's social, it's economic, it's whether people would actually want to live on that site. How do you decide whether 1,000 houses there are viable?
Will be two stages from that. There will be what's necessary for the 2050 plan, which is we've already touched on, is a high-level plan to deal with strategic issues, which may take a view on X, that it in broad terms it can deliver it. Then the district plan is going to have to get down to the drilled detailed level of what that is capable of dealing. It could be that if you still have all these asks of this amount, and therefore it's not viable to deliver X thousands, but it could be A, if it delivered more, or B, if you reduce what the asks are. There's a balance in which way you take that, and that's the purpose of having that viability evidence, to be able to make those judgments to what policy you put into the final document is on a sound basis and a balanced approach, because it must be able to be a delivered option at the end of it.
So you're saying that the calculation, for instance, whether you use standard method or transformation or whatever, that's done at a policy level, but at a strategic level, you'll decide where to put the 100,000 or 150,000 houses. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, it will need to be underpinned by a whole set of evidence, and that's where I was coming from. There's some vital bits still to be done, and one of those is the viability process.
Right, okay, and so the viability might actually reduce the numbers that we can build in Oxfordshire.
Because of all the other asks that you wish, and therefore the balance has to be taken in how you come to those judgments.
Right, okay, right, thank you very much. Dick, you've got a question or a comment?
Chair, I think we've had an hour and a half on questions. I'd quite like for us to actually say something. So, and this is high level stuff, not detailed stuff about viability. This is about the document that's before us. I had drafted a recommendation before the meeting. Of course, you know, we've had a discussion. I feel actually that it's picked up a lot of what my colleagues have said, possibly not in the way that they've said it. And I want to float it with you, if I may, because I appreciate Rachel saying that the report was meant to be clear and transparent. Well, for me, it isn't. Not really. It doesn't give me any kind of steer, really. It feels like here's a board in which we've just written up all the different things that anonymous people said. Doesn't give me any kind of steer. So that's the kind of feeling that's behind my recommendation. It sounds from what Rachel has said that actually in the next stage, as we move forward, a rather more thorough report is going to be required by the inspectorate on what the consultation actually said and was about. And I think my recommendation is asking for that. So it may be that this is a piece of work that actually you're going to do anyway. Can I read you what I've said, what I've drafted here? I'll read it carefully because it's been very difficult to try and put this into words, but I hope that it picks up what people have said. The Regulation Consultation Report summarises the key messages from the public consultation. One unstated key message is that on 10 out of 32 policy options, there was not only no clear steer for officers charged with drafting the plan proposals for the next phase, but a clear failure to agree or outright polarisation between respondents who, for the most part, are not identified in the report. The same is broadly true for 3 out of the 5 spatial options. No clear steer. This begs the question of which respondents' views will be afforded priority as the Regulation 19 draft is formulated. By the time that work is complete, many policy options will have been discarded. In order, therefore, to interpret this consultation report and note its true implications, it would be necessary to know where the fault lines lie. You know, where are these failures to agree, i.e. between which groups of respondents, which voices, if you like, are in contradiction with each other. It would also be helpful to know which of these respondents are accountable in some way to the people of Oxfordshire, who will have to live with the final plan, and which respondents generally represent other interests. In the interest of public accountability, I would like the Scrutiny Committee to make a recommendation that before proceeding to the next stage of the process, Cabinet should ask for a brief supplementary report clarifying the existing feedback data that sets out amongst which groups of respondents' views tended to coalesce on issues where across the whole there was a conflict of views. I'm sorry, that's messy. I might have to read that again. Where did groups of voices coalesce at different points of disagreement? So who is it in contention with who? The public may then be able to gain a picture of whose interests the resulting Regulation 19 plan proposals best represent.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know how clear that is.
No,
I'm happy to try and explain it if it isn't.
No, that's very clear, actually, Dick. I was writing it down as you were saying it, and I think that's a very clear recommendation. I think we'll take the other raised hands and then we'll go on to recommendations. Okay, Alex and Chris and Hosni, I think your hand is raised, but I don't know if you've taken it down, Hosni. Hello?
Well, should I do mine while
Yes.
you're checking that? Check?
Yeah, I have taken it down. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, In answer to Dick's very long recommendation, I would hazard a guess that people who are opposed to building houses are coalesced at the bottom end of the housing numbers, and those who wish to build houses, so developers and landowners, are coalesced at the top. And as Linda pointed out, 655 odd thousand people haven't expressed an opinion, which makes it quite difficult. I think it's very predictable. But in the end, I think you've got to make some kind of judgment as to where your values, your ethics, your moral position, your political position, all those kinds of things take you. So I just wanted to kind of pick up one point in response, and then just raise an issue which has been missing from the conversation, I think. Nigel's point about Regulation 18 consultation and the format and use of options. I completely agree with him. If he recollects what the Oxford one looked like, we set out what options we weighed up, which one was preferred, which ones were not preferred, which ones were ambivalent on. I argued for that approach. It was not taken. I regret that, but it is what it is. My personal view is that we need fewer policies and more options on them. I think there are far too many policies in this, and I've said that I think it needs to be thinned down to ones that really matter. We could, if we were going to be absolutely minimalist, go down to the number of houses, where they should go, so the spatial options and the infrastructure needs to support them. But I think you'd want to go a bit further than that. But I think there's a whole load of other stuff here which is just referencing things which are properly dealt with in local plans, and I don't think should be in a strategic level plan at all, because the local plans are already doing it. So I think there's a whole load of stuff you could go through with a red pencil and say, actually, local plans do that. Anyway, so on the housing numbers and the 3 trajectories, I just wanted to draw people's attention to this, because I think in talking about these abstract things, it's always worth getting something that's very much not abstract. Paragraph 436 sets out the 3 trajectories that you were alerted to at the beginning. Essentially, these are the number of homes needed from the end of the current local plans to 2050. So over 15 years. It's not an exact 15 years because the local plans don't quite line up. Let's call it 15 years for the purposes of maths. The 3 trajectories are 16,000 additional homes, so 1,000 a year, 37,000 additional homes, so 2,500 a year, and 67,000 homes, so 4,500 a year. The assessment of the need for affordable housing, and big proviso on this has only been assessed to the 2030 point, is 3,200 units per year. That's the current need for affordable housing. So the low trajectory is under, well, it's a third of the number of just affordable housing, let alone anything else. The middle trajectory is slightly under the need for affordable housing. The large trajectory, which has, as Nigel has rightly said, massive implications for infrastructure, for Greenbelt and all sorts of other things, actually is the only one that meets the affordable housing need. So if you're going to be driven solely by the affordable housing number, the only one you should be looking at is the top level one. Now, there's plenty of reasons why you shouldn't be looking at the top level one, which I don't want to kind of influence your views on that, but I think there's really significant stuff around that. But I think in sort of, I would regret having to spend an awful lot of time picking holes in the nature of the consultation report, and not focusing on these really big issues of how many homes do we actually think we need to meet the needs for everyone in Oxfordshire, not just the very wealthy. How many homes do we need to support the economy of Oxfordshire, which is growing, and I would argue very robustly is not something we can simply switch off and make go somewhere else. That is not how economies work. And therefore, where should they go? And I would finish by saying there's probably a mixture of spatial options that we're going to need to pursue. But given the climate crisis, given the traffic crisis, given the abject failure of the structure plan policies for Oxfordshire, which shifted homes and jobs and scattered them across the county and ended up with people commuting on our roads in huge numbers for decades, there's a really strong argument for focusing employment where there's public transport and homes where there's employment. And that leads you to some of those options being markedly better than others. And it would be very interesting, maybe not now, because I think these are big issues and you probably need to, I've been immersed in them for 2 years, but I think those are what I would really welcome hearing from Scrutiny on at a point appropriate for you. And, when you've had a chance to think and digest on them. And it would be most useful to just get that sense of where you as the Scrutiny Committee stand on what I think are absolutely fundamental issues on this. Not that the consultation is unimportant, but that looks backward and we need to look forward. And that was kind of my finishing point.
Thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate what you say about fear policies being needed, and that you put a red line through quite a lot of these here because they're actually at the wrong level. And that might be something that we might come back to you or Rachel in the very near future on. I mean, if the policy document's overloaded, then it's not useful to anybody. Right. I was going to call on Hosni and then Chris and then Nigel. I'm aware, because Dick has already mentioned it, that time's getting on, but I think this is a really important discussion. Even if we can't reach all the recommendations we want to this evening, I think it's opened it up in a way that's I think very useful to move it forward. Right, Hosni, your turn. Are you there?
Yeah, I am. Sorry.
Great.
I'll just keep it very brief. So I've just got the baby here. I was just going to say it is. I think the points that Nigel and Linda made were very valid earlier on. I did a quick calculation, and that showed of the Oxfordshire population that the survey actually covered 0.058% of the population. I mean, that is extremely low, and we need to somehow do better. I don't know how. I haven't got the answers as to how that is. And also, I would really like, I mean, I did like some of what Dick mentioned there, but I do think we really need a separation of the developers and some of the viability calculations, because yes, certain viability calculations are about the housing that we need. And Alex, thank you, that was really useful. But some of it, especially if developers are commenting on it, viability calculations, as we know, is also sometimes around profit. And that really needs to be separated out in a much more coherent way for our population. Otherwise, we're getting a really mixed document that is not us representing our constituents, it's also us representing the interests of developers within that. And that needs really, really clear separation there to make it much more coherent and for us to be able to comment on it meaningfully. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris, could we hear from you?
Thank you. I apologise for going against Dick's exhortation for statements, not questions. I'm afraid questions are all I've got at the minute, so I'll have to disobey him on this instance. Just two quick questions. One is taking up one of the points from one of the groups that wrote to us. I think this is in CPRE's email. They put the question of whether the plan we eventually arrive at ought to take a position on housing density and targets relating to housing density. Do we have any position on whether or not that ought to be the case? Is there any prospect of it being the case? And secondly, a little bit more generally, obviously what we have here is a scattering of opinions. We've heard a lot of talk about how they are not particularly representative and skewed in various ways. Is there any prospect of us using any more representative ways of sampling opinion going forwards in the process? Whether we're talking about using actual professional pollsters to ask some of these questions which would get you a representative opinion, but that of people because it's deep stuff, the majority of those respondents are not going to have particularly deep knowledge of the subject, or even by using an assembly-like mechanism where you make an effort to go into greater depth and to get at something representative from a group which is strongly informed about the questions.
I can answer the first question. I'm not going to try and answer the second question. Is that all right? The answer to the first question, I think the best I would suggest that you could get is an aspiration for highest appropriate densities or some wording like that. There is absolutely no way that you get a number for density that would work in the middle of an urban area and in a village. And the leader of Cherwell District Council made it abundantly clear at the last meeting that density stuff at local level is a local plan issue, and he's not going to be told what Cherwell's local plan should say on the matter. So I think that's probably a no, though I do completely get the point. So I'd push it, but see where we go.
Rachel, do you want to comment on the question of getting more representative opinion?
It's always a challenge to get good quantity and quality of responses to a planning document. From experience, I would just say that at the beginning of a plan project, you tend to get, so by the beginning of the plan project, I mean Regulation 18 Part 1, a large number of responses of quite not to underplay them, but fairly superficial level. And as the plan project progresses, you tend to get generally fewer number of responses and a greater depth of understanding. And so that would be quite normal. However, I would say it is always a challenge to get a representative view. Because the question is, whose view are we trying to represent? So generally, it's easier to get the views of people of a certain demographic. So to characterize it, people in mid to later life, and that's partly because they have time perhaps and resources to go through the document in lots of detail. What you tend to struggle with is younger people, so that's where additional mechanisms come in, and we've experimented with some of those quite successfully in the city and at the Oxfordshire Plan level, and I think we need to do that again at later stages. However, it's very easy to get the views of people who are current residents of a place. What we're planning for is the future generation. And they might be people who, so we're talking about children, basically. It's quite hard to envisage what they might need for the future. So I guess I just throw that in as a complex matter of who is the representative. And I can completely understand concern about overly weighting responses from a housing developer, for example. But that's not to say that their project is inherently bad or something we want to discourage. We do need to create homes for the future generations. I would just stress we haven't done any weighting of these comments to date. This is just a factual report, and it's not that any of that kind of work has happened to date. We will need to look at lots of different methods and tools to engage with as many different people as possible. It's always a challenge. It can be quite expensive, but we need to be innovative and try new things, I think, at each stage to do better at each stage of the consultation process.
I'm wondering from Chris's question and your reply, whether one of our recommendations tonight, if we make one, would be to explore how to get views across the demographic and, of course, across Oxfordshire. I know it's expensive, but there are 5 districts, all of whom should be contributing, because we need to know what they think out there as well, don't we? As well as what we think in the city.
Yeah, I'd be very much in favour of making a recommendation in that direction, especially because, I mean, I appreciate it's very difficult, especially when it comes to residents outside, but at least when it comes to the question of residents inside, you know, we know how to do it. It just takes money, time and effort to do it. And obviously the money to do like professional grade polling is significant, but it's also a plan which goes forward 3 decades. So it would seem like probably money well spent. So yeah, I'd definitely like to hear more specifics about how we will get more representative sampling.
Thank you. Nigel, your comment, question.
I'd like to hear what Alex has got to say to this, because I've just been mulling over the spatial option about Oxford-led growth, which was the other thing that really leapt off the page at me in this paper. And I kind of, just let me work this through a little bit. I mean, I have issues about the feasibility of it. and the reality of it. There are also issues about the fairness of it, actually, quite strong feelings about that. I don't really want a two-tier kind of Oxfordshire, where, you know, Oxford is full of wealth and prosperity, and the rest of the county is increasingly sort of dislocated and left behind. And there's a big risk if you have Oxford-led growth, that's what actually happens. I'm sure there's lots of evidence of rural poverty and rural and deprivation and underachievement and all sorts of things in some of the smaller towns in the county. I haven't done the research, but my instinct tells me that they're not all, you know, equally prosperous, and nothing not as prosperous as Oxford. So I'm not sure that framing the growth question as should we have Oxford-led growth or not is helpful in this respect. A, because the spillover effects of Oxford growth are not kept within Oxford. Point one, they reverberate everywhere out for many miles. Two, they're quite divisive, a phrase like that. And three, they can also perpetuate inequality. So for three reasons, I kind of get nervous about that. I just wanted to share that observation. And therefore, my recommendation is along the lines of reviewing the framing of the question, really, I suppose, about growth, and asking how helpful it is to see it in that way, whilst admitting that Oxford is an engine of economic growth, which of course is true. But I'm not sure that framing the question that way is helpful. But maybe I'm just being too purist, and Alex will tell me I'm talking double Dutch.
You've got the opportunity to respond, Alex.
Yeah, sorry. My computer's having some kind of slow technical death, which means that I've lost the document with the 5 spatial options in it. It's no longer available to me. Oxford-led growth was one of the spatial options. There were 5 new settlements. There was focus on public transport corridors. And my personal preference is the focus on the public transport corridors one. I mean, in essence, it's the 2014 Wolfson Prize scheme that Urbed won with. It's what do they call it? It was essentially Oxford turned upside down, and then with a big public transport system running up the middle of Oxfordshire. I think the points I would make are poverty. Yes, there are levels of the pockets of poverty in rural parts of Oxfordshire. Berensfield, Carterton stand out as being places with poverty issues. But the primary places with poverty in Oxfordshire are Banbury and Oxford, the 2 major urban areas. So I think it's right to reflect on the range of different levels of wealth and the differences between urban and rural areas. And there are some real challenges, I think, around services in rural areas, which come from any plan. I mean, I grew up in a small village. That village no longer has a school, no longer has a GP that visits, just about has a church, but doesn't have a priest that visits. The shops, the one thing that survived, the bakers is gone, and so on and so on and so on. And that is a microcosm of every village up and down the country. So there is a real challenge there, but I don't think you address it by doing the kind of forced scattering policies which were inherent in the structure plans of the 1980s. And it's a certain irony that the main proponents of those are the ones who are making quite a lot of noise about this plan. It's their planning vision which led to the A40 having, you know, 2/3 of the population of an estate in Witney getting in a car and driving into Oxford, which is what was happening in the early 90s. You know, so I think there are some real positive options that you can take here, but they come with consequences and you need to think them through. I think my comment at this final stage is, and I appreciate you've spent 2 hours on this, and I'm very grateful for that, is that it's good to do consultation, but in the end, somebody's got to express an opinion. And other than Linda's proposals, particular policies, no one's expressed an opinion on any of the policies in the plan as yet. And maybe the time isn't right to do that. But at some point, this council and the other 4 councils will have to express an opinion on the amount of growth, the amount of housing, what kind of housing, and where that housing should go, what kind of jobs and where those jobs should go, and what the infrastructure that might be needed to support those homes and jobs. And they may do it, as has just been said, for people who haven't not yet been born, since we're going to 2050, and we're looking at people who might be starting families in 28 years' time. So at some point we will need to express a view on those, and I think my experience over a long time is that you can do a lot of consultation, but in the end you can't outsource the consultation. Collectively and individually, we will have to come to views on that, and that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think we need to draw this together for tonight anyhow. I have questions in my mind as to whether we're ready to actually come up with full recommendations. I'm concerned about it because I know that Rachel and the team are refining the options at the moment and gathering more evidence and so on. We're being asked at a pretty inchoate stage, I think, to make recommendations, and that worries me.
You do have a recommendation before you, Liz.
We've got several recommendations before us, Dick, thank you very much, but none of them are central really to the questions of moving this forward. They are recommendations which are helpful, but I don't think they actually go to the nub of this, which is what we want to do about the report as a whole. Several people have said that it's not a report that's actually ready for us to make the right level of recommendations on, and I've got a certain amount of sympathy with that. So I suppose my take on it, which you may all think differently about, but I throw it in for what it's worth, is that we make the recommendations that we've had this evening, assuming they're agreed, but I'd like to bring this back. And I'd like to bring it back with more information available to us. I know that's a big ask to the members of the committee and to the officers as well. You know, I know how pressed you all are at the moment, but I feel very uncomfortable about this at present. I think enough of us have said that we're not sure about the level that we're being asked to communicate our recommendations, and that really concerns me a lot. I need more information. I need to know what the evidence base is going to be. I need to know, and I think Rachel has said this, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, that we can also come up with ideas of where evidence may be taken from. There hasn't been an opportunity, even in the 2 hours we've had, to look at that. We've really just scrabbled around the outside, which I think is what we could do, having read the 286 odd pages. I think most of us have probably read most of them, but it still feels inchoate to me. And that's nobody's fault. I'm not criticising any of the officers, because you're doing something different from what we can reasonably comment on, I think. We just don't have enough information. We've got various options which have been opened, but we haven't got very much evidence on which to make recommendations. I think we're very stuck, but I'm very happy to hear what everybody else thinks on that. I may be alone in this, but if you want to, we can just go for the recommendations that 3 or 4 people this evening have made. They're all good recommendations. I'm not criticising them. I just don't think that they get to the heart of what Scrutiny should be doing in looking at this feedback report and the report itself, because Rachel made the point that we had to look at the report itself and at the feedback. But we need more than that. We need the evidence as well, the evidence that you're beginning to gather about the Greenbelt review and so on. We haven't got any of that. It just feels very uncomfortable to me. Okay, I've said enough. Adrian and then Alex, and then let's look at the recommendations we have to date.
Chairman, I need to bring it to members' attention that the report sets out a number of recommendations for members to note. Yeah. And that's quite important that still is either noted or you disagree with it. And the one to do with the adoption of the statement of community involvement is quite important too, to bear in mind. The other recommendations that have happened through the evening that you and others have had is whether they get formulated and taken back. But I understand your last point is whether to bring it back. all I can do is note that because as to how we take it forward is yet to be decided, and it ultimately would be a matter for the cabinet to listen to that. So they're the bits that I would flag up for members for this evening.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
My comment and twofold. One, if you want to have it back, and I encouraged you to do that, so I'm very supportive of that. I think it's absolutely imperative that you say what it is that you want in front of the committee, not now necessarily, but before the committee, because otherwise it's impossible for officers across 5 councils to try and guess what it is that you want to look at, and so on. So I think, you know, specify the things, you know, collectively decide it, or through the chair or whatever. But I think that's crucial. And secondly, you know, things like Greenbelt review and all the rest of it, you're talking about the entire evidence base for something that's a strategic level plan. A planning inspector would take several months to work through that evidence base and then have several weeks of public hearings. I think you're being way over ambitious if you're wanting to look at the entire evidence base. I just don't think it's in any way remotely feasible that you'll be able to do anything meaningful with it. So I think you really need to focus in on the issues you do want to look at quite tightly, and, you know, go on the summary. So I mean, if you wanted to frame the discussion around affordable housing, you've got the numbers, you could frame it around affordable housing. You could do something around employment or whatever it might be. But I think asking for the entire technical evidence base, I think you're just trying to do a public inquiry in 2 hours, and I don't think that's feasible.
Okay, thank you. Linda.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to see the report come back to us at a suitable juncture. And I think in terms of the question was put, we need to be clear about what it is we'd like to see come back to us. Well, I think Dick's proposal actually set out quite well what we'd like to see come back to us in terms of how the report is presented. And I would just add in there what I said about seeing the results of the focus group that was carried out as well. But I think there's 2 separate issues. There's the process and the bureaucracy, but and that recommendation relates to that. But I don't think we should be scared of making recommendations about the substance at this point as well, which is what my 3 earlier recommendations were about. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Thank you very much. Right, shall we start with the recommendations that have been made this evening, and see if we can agree to those going forward to cabinet next week? Yep. So it starts with Linda's 3 recommendations, which I have here. Yep. The first one is about the Thames water situation, investment in sorting out the sewage and water problems. Yep. Recommendation that be considered in the report. Yep. Am I putting that in the right way, Linda?
Yeah, the importance of future growth aligning with investment in water treatment works is fully acknowledged.
And the second,
and there's no point getting hung up about definite wording, because that, because of the process that we're going through, in the negotiating with various partners. But I think that the report is weak in that area at the moment, and it should be given greater prominence.
We should flag it up. And your second recommendation was similar, but it was about parks, green spaces, and so on. Yep.
This committee should support the alternative policy option outlined in the report. But I mean, that policy option talks about sports, spaces for sports, indoors and outdoors. The policy option I would like to see would be about protecting those spaces, public spaces for outdoor sports, such as playing fields, and also play areas, parks and nature reserves.
Yep, lovely. And the third one, I didn't write down. You'll have to tell me what it is.
It was in regards to reducing inequality and deprivation, and the fact that it was to be a distinct policy rather than scattered throughout the document. It was to have its own focus.
Yep.
Yeah, but I do also take on board what Alex was saying about the need for. Sorry, I was on mute. I do also take on board what Alex was saying about the need for fewer policies. So I don't think it's a case of just bolting that on. Perhaps it is a case of, you know, when reconsidering the policies in the document, that becomes a central one, and like some of the other policy areas, whether that's about education and training and those other things, that they could actually, or lots of different areas could come under a more central heading of reducing inequality and deprivation.
It still seems sensible to include it as a recommendation, doesn't it? But the other form of it, yep. You can agree between you, I think, outside the meeting. Right. Then moving on to other recommendations. Dick started by saying he had a recommendation that the report wasn't fit for purpose, but I think we moved on a long way from that. That was an hour and a half ago, and I think we'll put that in a different shape, even if we. I
think I can do that. I think I can do that, actually, Liz. I mean, you've got a rather a lengthy thing, which was preamble and then a recommendation.
Yeah.
Picking up Alex's point about,
you've got that down. Do you want to read it out, or would you want to read it out? I was going to leave out the preamble and just read out the recommendation.
Well, I can do that. I'm just saying, I mean, it's a little bit simpler, I think, than it needs to be. I'm picking up what Alex has said about, you know, what needs to come back to the Scrutiny Committee. Going through that report, as it says in the preamble that I wrote there, on 10 out of 32 policy options, there was a failure to agree or outright polarisation. So those are clearly the pinch points. They were the pinch points that emerged from the consultation. And the recommendation was about knowing, well, actually, okay, what was that conflict? Who was it that's arguing about this? What are the different issues to do with this? Because that's where, you know, we can usefully comment, and it's a political question. It's partly our job, I think. So, okay, so where is the politics in this, and what can we do with that? Now, I mean, I think that's me summing up what I think I was aiming at there and picking up what other people have said. So if we wanted to drill down a little bit and say, well, look, it may not be 10, it may be just we can pick 5 out of those. We know what the big ones are. And as Alex says, it's not rocket science to guess where the fault lines actually lie. But let's look at those and pick those up. And in order to do that, we just need a little bit of work, which may not be very much work, and it may be work that's going to be happening anyway, just to spell out where are those pinch points, who is it that's behind the fault lines, you know, what are the political issues for us to deal with, and then we can do a little bit of work on those. And then you can start getting more into the specifics, I think, of the specific policies like Greenbelt or housing numbers, you know, which are actually next layer down. But as Alex says, the housing numbers are probably, you know, one of the biggest out of those 32. Does that make any sense? You know, it's just, let's focus, let's have a little bit more information, please, about those pinch points, the conflicts.
Where the data,
who's behind them,
who provides the data,
and the data behind them, you know, which is there in the consultation responses, but they've got a top level thing.
Right. Is that a feasible thing to do, Rachel?
I'll have to go away and inquire, I'm afraid. I didn't myself pull together the report that's in front of you, so I'll need to ask about that.
Okay. I think we'll put the recommendation in, and if you can come back to Tom and discuss with him how this can be done. I think that's the best way forward at the moment. It's complicated. Nigel.
Well, this might not be the right point for this, so Rachel, I need to be guided by you really. But I mean, for me, there are 3 questions really, or 3 issues. One is to interrogate the basis of the proposed housing numbers and the wider implications of those choices. So if I was writing as a recommendation, I'd say urge Cabinet to do that forensically, you know. And secondly, to understand better the relationship between whatever housing number options are preferred and the supply of affordable housing, because the two are entirely linked together. And the third one is to review the framing of the spatial something question, spatial policy question around focusing growth in Oxford and its kind of wider implications. I mean, I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this because I don't think it's necessarily helpful, but we can argue about that. But I think it's a legitimate question, let's put it like that. So now those three things, Rachel, maybe this might not be the right moment for this. It may be after the next round of consultation that those things should be on the table as bits of advice and encouragement to Cabinet to do, or is it appropriate to ask that to happen now? Question mark.
I would suggest that we make it as a recommendation now. If you hadn't asked for it, Nigel, I was going to myself as a recommendation, assuming we get the support of the members. I don't think it does any harm to codify.
I suppose one is flagging up one's nervousness about the big issues. Yeah. At some point, we'll need to be satisfied that the evidence is strong and the choices are reasonable and they're made rationally and so on and so forth, which is obviously too early at the moment to know because the evidence isn't in front of us. But I think going back to Dick's point and others, we need you need to understand the reasonable level of evidence to understand that the choices are legitimate, if you like. They're perfect, but they're legitimate.
It's a chicken and an egg situation, though, isn't it?
It is a chicken and egg situation. And I feel like it's probably take weeks and months to do it, and all of that, and I accept all of that. But I think they're legitimate questions to ask.
Yes. Well, so
I'm happy to send some words to Tom tomorrow.
Could you send some words to Tom? Assuming the thing that I have failed to do as we've gone through the recommendations is to ask people whether they support them. Which I apologise for. So we've had the three recommendations from Linda, okay? And then we've got Dick's recommendation, which is going to be put into a more manageable form, but the frame of it makes sense to me. We're going to clarify where the data comes from, who's provided it, in the case of each of the policies. Okay, is everybody content with that? Or adequately content, okay? Right, and then we've got Nigel interrogating the basis of the housing numbers and particularly looking at affordable housing. We do need clarity on that, and I think anybody looking at the Reg 19 report is going to have that. It's not going to make sense to them otherwise, so I think it's really important that we do that. Then we've got Chris's recommendation to explore getting views across the demographics, because inevitably older people have the time and the experience and the knowledge and the wisdom, and I speak of myself, of course, to actually do this. But in fact, it needs to be across the demographics if we can get it, starting with the sixth formers and working upwards. So I do think that's vital, expensive, but I think important. All of this is going to take time, isn't it? Sorry, I see some hands up. I see Dick's hand up. No, Lexi hand. Anybody else's hand up at the moment? Where have we got to? Yeah, I was going to suggest a recommendation myself, which is that as the officers decide on the evidence that they need, that comes back. Who would it come back to? I'd like it to come back to the Scrutiny Committee, actually, because at the moment we don't know what you consider the important evidence is. It may be different from what we consider, and I very much hope that we're going to be able to see, do I mean an amended report? I mean a further draft of the at the beginning of the Reg 19 report will come back to us, and I think we need to see that as soon as we can, but I'm not sure how soon that can be. There's a lot of work, isn't there, is what's come over to me this evening. Because at the moment, it's not ready to go out for Reg 19. Does that make sense? Am I meeting any agreement on that?
Yeah. I'd like to know, maybe Rachel could explain to us the time pressure she is under to get on to stage 2 of consultation.
There is a good amount of time pressure. Just on the point of evidence base, I would point you towards the Oxfordshire Plan website. So that's oxfordshirePlan.org. I mentioned earlier that a number of the technical evidence-based studies have already been published and are available at your leisure on that website. So the document that was referred to right at the beginning of this meeting that explored the housing need for the county, that's published and on the website. It's a very big document and it's quite technical. It's not necessarily an easy read, but for those of you that are keen to see more of the technical evidence-based work behind the Oxfordshire Plan project, I would suggest that oxfordshirePlan.org is a good place to go, because there are a number of those technical studies already published. If I might also suggest that there would be a lot of value in you having a conversation at your earliest convenience on some of those big choices that need to be taken in the Oxfordshire Plan. It might be that you don't have the finite detail in order to make a final choice at this stage, but I think there's a lot of value about talking around the priorities and the choices that need to be made. So if you look back at the Regulation 18 Part 2 document, we have identified the idea of those policy options is that there's enough of a framework there to have a meaningful conversation. And as I say, it might be that you can't conclude with a firm recommendation one way or the other with the information in front of you, but you could do quite a lot to refine what your priorities and choices would be if it were just to this committee. So I think some of Councillor Chapman's points about housing numbers and implications, relationships between different policies, you can have those conversations now at this point. I think there is some real merit to do that now, not necessarily wait until you have all the answers, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's very helpful, thank you. Adrian.
It's just to add a bit to do with the time element. Yeah. The 2050 plan needs to continue at some pace, because our own local plan will be under more and more pressure, and it becomes harder to then put our own local plan in place. So the longer we take in dealing with all the evidence, all the policy issues, and slimming it down and scrutinising it to the nth degree, there's a balance in there. And not that I'm against scrutiny, because I'm all for it, and we have to build the timetable to it. But it can't go on forever and a day, because then we won't get our own local plan put to bed. We will just be out on a limb, and that's no good for us. And the same implication will be for the other districts, that they are under the same time pressure. The development industry won't wait forever and a day. So we need to make steady progress through this process. And it mustn't be forgotten that that's critical to this process too.
Could I ask a practical question to you, Adrian, which is simply, what sort of time frame are we talking about if you were to come back to discuss some of these additional issues? Sort of, when would you get the balance between having the best amount of evidence without holding up other things?
Tom, it's not within my gift to take a position at this moment in time, because we're working with our other partners, and there are a collective view that needs to come about. But I know the chief executives and leaders of the various different councils are in a discussion that needs to take place to try and set what that time frame might be going forward, because then it's possible to then see how many opportunities there are to engage scrutiny and other parties and other key stakeholders in this process within it. If that time frame comes short, then the opportunities become less. If the time frame gets stretched out a bit, then we have greater opportunities. At this moment in time, that decision has not been made.
Okay.
Are you able at least simply to give some indication, i.e., come March and April, we're in PERDA, and then there will be a new committee being set up. So if it's not really by the beginning of PERDA, there wouldn't be an opportunity for scrutiny to look at anything until June. at the very earliest. Would that be too late for you practically?
Not in respect to the Reg 19 stage. It is whether how many other opportunities we want to build into the process. The sooner we can come to a view about the timetable that we're going to look at, then it's easier to work out the other bits of the puzzle, if that makes sense. So if it's soon before we get to PERDA, then that's helpful to then start looking at those timetables to whether you start hitting scrutiny in informal or formal positioning in the summer months, for the sake of argument. That might be possible, but until I know what timetable that we're all trying to work to, it's just very difficult to give greater clarity. I can surmise on lots of things, but I don't think that's helpful, other than as soon as we have something, then we will inform the various different stakeholders and groups of what we're going to try and do.
Okay, sure, thank you.
Does that leave us in a position where we could bring this back before us, for instance, on the 7th of March, which is a month away and before PERDA starts? How much further forward are we going to be on the 7th of March? If these recommendations that we're going to make tonight can obviously go forward to Cabinet next week, but I think we feel at the moment that we're not in a position to make the level of recommendations that we'd want to. I don't know if we'll be able to do that on the 7th of March. It depends on how quickly information can be got together.
Chairman, a lot of things that you were talking about to do with evidence, and Alex touched on that, that is going to be for later on in the day into the summer, because just on some of the practical bits that we've got to put together, without sounding funny, that's months and months of work that have got to be done, and we're already aware that we need to get on with it as quick as possible. That's without any other changes that Rachel flagged up with the white paper and where the government wants to go. That adds another constraint to and pressure to the situation. The quicker we want to go, the greater the cost is, and whether that's on the consultation process or what other consequences. So at this moment in time, for your meeting on the 7th, I couldn't give you an indication whether we're going to be able to address lots of the bits that you've flagged up. Alex has touched on, we can take them to Cabinet, and potentially other decisions may start to be formulated about timelines and whether there is other opportunities to engage with scrutiny committees, because all the 5 partners are very aware of the need to make sure we do a better job through the scrutiny process than happened before, because it misses a massive opportunity to add that value, as I touched on at the early part of the meeting.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we're not in a position to actually come up with a clean set of recommendations and just move it forward. But I
wouldn't be too hard on ourselves. I think we've made some, quite a lot of progress tonight, and we've got some things to say, and we're going to say them to Cabinet. I think we need to get some advice between now and the next meeting as to whether there's any value in returning to this subject in March, or whether we won't have what we need. And then we have to accept that if the on balance, it's not worth returning to. I mean, we might have some sort of update report or something like that, but we're not going to be in a decision, real tightening of the decision-making side in March, is my view. Within 4 weeks, unlikely. I think Adrian's steer is clear on that, really. And then we have to go into PERDA and then pick up the pieces in the story in June, after we've had our elections with a new committee. And there'll still be time, because the consultation level 19 will still be running, or whether if it's finished by then June, it won't have all been mashed up and worked out. Then you can come in at that point and say, okay, we've seen the second level of consultation. These are the pinch points. These are the choices. We now want to make some recommendations about choices. And these are the recommendations about choices we want to make. I think that's perfectly respectable. I don't think, we should kick ourselves too hard about trying to make choices in 4 weeks about bloody complicated things where the officers realistically can't do the work in time. It's just that's my instinct about this, having heard the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Nigel, and I go along with that. I mean, I'm wondering if we should flag up that we'd like to make a space for it on the March 7th Scrutiny Committee.
and then come to a view as to how to use that time, depending on what we've learned in the next few weeks. And
could I raise one practical issue, yes, which is that there are already at Cabinet, there are going to be 13 papers going to Cabinet, I think, in March. So the agenda for scrutiny in March is already fairly chocker with some quite heavy hitting reports. In many ways, if you were to want a meeting, it would be better to have a special meeting than to try and tack it on to what's already on the work plan.
I think this is important enough for us to have it as a special meeting if we can't fit it in on the 7th of March. I know that's a big stress on all of us because the elections are getting close apart from anything else, plus everything else that we've managed to fit in our lives. But I do think this is probably the most important thing that we're going to be dealing with in the next few months. We have to get it right. And the recommendations that we got tonight are fine, but I feel it's only a start. There are two people, Chris and Hosni, both wanting to come in. Can we hear from you? Chris first, and then Hosni.
I just want to ask, isn't it the case that sort of the boundaries between what is scrutiny and what is just politics are getting quite blurred here? In that Alex was exhorting us to take positions on which policies we think ought to be pursued to the next stage. And that seems to me like straightforwardly a political decision. I walked in today with the impression that scrutiny, because it is supposed to take that less political angle, ought to concern itself with the technical matters of the proper gathering of information and the sort of correct synthesis of information and fair representation of information and things of this form, but that the questions as to which policies ought to be taken forwards and which policies ought the city ultimately to adopt, they seem like utterly political decisions and therefore not particularly scrutiny things. Yeah, where are we on that? Does that make any sense?
Would you like me to come in, Chair?
Yes, please.
My own reading of it is that actually, when we're talking about politics, we want to avoid party politics, i.e. setting different parties against one another and disregarding things based on who's saying it rather than what the evidence says. What I was hearing Alex suggesting was that if there's enough evidence to look at this, then scrutiny is being asked to weigh that evidence. And that to me seems perfectly reasonable. It's not party political, it's hearing what evidence is there and making a call and a recommendation to Cabinet based on that. So I would be fine with that.
That's very helpful, Tom. Hosni, can we hear
I am very sympathetic, Rachel, to your workload and to the schedule that you have, because clearly this problem is a systemic issue and it's not anything to do with you or other colleagues. And I feel very sympathetic towards you as a person. You know, I think that's very important to say. But on the other hand, I do think the general public gets the impression if we were to comment and give directions extra on things when we don't have very clear defining issues on all the separate parts of this that we've commented on, I think it gives the wrong impression of a kind of democratic influence that we don't have. And I think one thing that I hear a lot, and I think has been very clear in our politics in recent times, is that people feel that politics is done to them rather than by them. And I think we need to make that clear when we don't have the information to make decisions, because otherwise it gives the impression that we've made decisions for our constituents and in fact for their grandchildren, when we don't have the right sort of information with the right level of detail and sub-classification, or, you know, all the points that have been raised. And I do realise that affects your timetable and I can't solve that for you, but I also feel very uncomfortable ever giving the impression that we know and are aware and can make decisions when we can't, because that is an issue with our democracy as far as I see it. And it happens a lot, and it's happened a lot to the extent that a lot of people don't vote now because of that, and that's not what we want to continue. But thank you for your hard work. I do appreciate it. It's really, really tough for you, and you've got a timetable to keep to.
I think what you've said is really important, Hosnia, and I'm sure that we all agree that there's no criticism of Rachel or indeed of any of the other officers. You know, you're doing a splendid job, and we're just coming in at the end and complicating your life. But I think doing it for the best reasons we can, because we are the Scrutiny Committee. If we're not doing it, there isn't anybody else to do it. That's what it comes down to. I think we need to move on, guys, because otherwise we're all going to die of hunger by 9 o'clock, which is serious. We have got some recommendations. I think the report that Tom is kindly going to write for us to Cabinet next week is going to be very important. And I think as far as it concerns Oxfordshire 2050, I think we need to agree it by email with members of the committee. I know that's not usual, but we're saying some quite complex things. I want to make sure that we get it right before it goes to them on the 9th, isn't it? So with your agreement, we will leave the recommendations as they are. Unless anybody has a further recommendation, I'm hoping that you won't actually. Other recommendations we may make when we come back either to an extraordinary scrutiny committee or to the committee on the 7th of March. Okay, are people reasonably happy that we move on from this now? Okay. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, people. And apologies, Adrian and Rachel. I think we lost Philip Wadsworth at an early stage. He obviously gave up the will to live. But I'm very grateful to the two of you for answering our questions so patiently. That's without you, we couldn't have done anything this evening, so we are very grateful. So go and have a large cup of coffee or something. Okay.
Yeah, here. I just want to say, endorse that absolutely 100%. Thank you very much.
Chairman, and noted. Quite happy to attend. It's very important. So me and Rachel will always be here to help you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Just to confirm, I'll get the draft out by Friday afternoon, and so you guys, if you can get it, any comments back by the end of the weekend, so that I can get it off to Cabinet on Monday, that'd be great.
Thanks very much, Tom. I just think it's important that we get the tone of this right. You know, particularly because we've heard so much from everybody. Okay, thank you. Right, so back to the beginning. We have to go right back to the beginning, actually. Apologies for absence. So Alice, you've been very quiet. Have we any apologies for absence?
Yes, we had apologies from Councillor Tidwell, and Councillor Diggins was substituting for her.
Yeah, I know that Lizzie had to leave. I saw that on the chat. Okay, thanks. Declarations of interest. Anybody like to admit to any declarations of interest at this moment? No. Okay, fine. Minutes. Okay. I'd like to zoom through this, but I don't think I can because there are a couple of amendments here. There are some from Marie Tidwell, which I think Tom has got. Tom, can I hand over to you on that?
Not quite, Chair. Marie sent me some amendments to the subsequent reports, so the Climate Emergency Review Group report rather than these minutes.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. And then continuing with the minutes, there are two amendments requested by Dick to paragraph 81. If you want to have a look at those minutes, can you manage to bring them up, people? Paragraph 81. Do you want me just to run through other amendments, or will you do that, Dick?
Hang on a minute. I'm happy to. I haven't got the text in front of me, but I mean, they're quite simple. They're just a couple of just a couple of omissions. One was,
yes,
you may remember there was a brief exchange about cable cars. I was responding to the Zero Carbon Oxford partnership and asked whether that was something that they should consider under their transport, and Tom responded, and that was all the minute addition I suggested, was just that brief exchange was mentioned. And the other one was under the equalities thing. Marie had quite a bit to say about disabilities in that, and I definitely remember saying that actually the retrofitting of our council housing also has major equalities impacts. Yeah, just straight fact, really. So.
I've now found the form of your amendments, and I'll just read them very quickly so everybody knows and can agree or not to them going in. The first one is between the definition of net zero and RAG rating. ZCOP, that's Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, Transport Workstream. Concern was expressed that the partnership should include examination of the proposals for a cable car into the city as an important means of reducing CO2 emissions and pollutants. So that would be the first bit to go into the minutes as an amendment. And certainly I've got a note that that was something that was discussed between Dick and Tom Hayes at the meeting. And then the second one is on the equalities impact bullet point further down. After the sentence, Councillor Hayes agreed to take that point back and ensure it was reflected in future reports. Insert, it was also pointed out that measures to reduce energy consumption in council-owned homes also had potentially significant equalities impact. So those are two changes to the minutes. Are we all okay with that? Can we agree that? Okay, thank you. Let me just move this out of the way so I can see you all. I'm sorry. Right, so minutes approved as a true and accurate record with those two amendments. Okay, right, and then moving on, work plan and forward plan. I'll hand over to you, Tom, because there have been some changes.
Yeah. First off, it seems actually a good thing given tonight, but apologies that the grant allocations was deferred. I know you did ask for it, but it has now gone back to September, so that's why it didn't come forward today. There has been a request. Cabinet is no longer going to be taking the allocation of homelessness prevention funds in February. It'll be taking it in March instead, but that news came very, very late to me. I've spoken with Linda Smith about it as chair of the Housing and Homelessness panel. She's happy for it to be deferred, but we do just want Scrutiny's to give its acceptance of that. And the final thing is that, as I referenced, there are an awful lot of papers going to Cabinet in March where there's some difficult decisions to be made as to what comes forward. My proposal was to take the Oxford Economic Strategy and City Centre Action Plan, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Strategy, and the Oxfordshire Recovery and Renewal Network reports. But if you look at the forward plan and see any reports that you thought trumped those in importance, please do say. I know that I've been asked on a number of occasions about the food strategy, and I was trying to sort of balance between which get priority. So I'd quite like to get the committee's view on that.
Right. Does anybody have any particular items that they think very much that they want to hear? Okay.
Well,
there is a hand up, Chair.
Nigel.
Oh, sorry, I think Paula's hand was up before me.
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course it is. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. I just wanted to flag that I do think the food strategy is extremely important, as we've got lots of food poverty in Oxford. So I don't know. My understanding of the national food strategy would be that we're looking at ways to make food accessible for everyone. So I'm really keen to address inequalities in that way and promote food and
Which report would you suggest drops out of the three I referenced, the Oxford Economic Strategy, the EDI strategy, or the Oxfordshire Recovery and Renewal Network?
Well, I suppose the EDI is kind of covered in if the food strategy is tackling inequalities, then in turn EDI will be addressed in that partly as well. That's just my opinion, though. Some people might disagree, but I just wanted to flag that.
I'm sorry, Tom. I don't think the framing of the question is. I know you're trying to be practical, but I'm not very comfortable with it, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't like major reports going to cabinet without a scrutiny. Let me just put my hand on the table, right? And I think that maybe some of them might drop off the end, but I wouldn't sacrifice equality, diversity, and inclusion, which is an overarching strategy around a really serious set of issues for the council, to forensically focus on food, which is a subset of it to some extent. So, Chair, sorry, if I was in the chair, I'd be saying, if it's going to be that amount of workload and in March, then either the workload has to be diminished, and that's maybe not practical, Tom, or we have to have some longer meeting, or we have to have another meeting or something. But I'm just not comfortable with a sort of pick and mix view where really substantial bits of stuff that are going to shape, for instance, the playing field strategy is very important, because we've had some pretty strong conversations within the Labour group. I don't think it's any surprise about playing fields and their place and development and all of that. So I think it's a very important issue. And I think it's something the public are also very concerned about. They are concerned that perhaps we're not doing our best to protect playing fields clearly enough. So again, I think that's something that, if we didn't read it and see it and even comment on it at all and had nothing to say about it, we're not doing our job properly. But that's an important piece of policy development there. So my view, Chair, would be if we need to have either longer meetings or a long meeting and a short meeting to sweep up stuff in the same way the planning committees have overspill meetings, so be it, frankly, because I'd rather have that than skimp on the work and do a thoroughly inadequate job. That's my personal view about it.
Paula, you'd like to come back on that?
Yeah, I wanted to agree with Nigel that we should have more meetings if necessary rather than picking one over the other. And I just wanted to clarify that in no way did I mean that the EDI is less important. My understanding of the council was that the EDI thread is meant to go through everything. And, we know that inequalities has not been addressed for the last 10 years, really. So I guess it is one that does need to be at the forefront, but as does all of them. So I think I would be happy to have another meeting if needed.
Okay, I'll look to find a date that's suitable for an extra meeting on that, and that kind of solves the key problems. Just so you know, Councillor Chapman, the playing field strategy has actually now, I think, slipped further since the publication of this agenda. So that's not one that is going to be missed out or was in danger of being missed out, but will come later in the year.
That's fine. You and the chair can work out what's coming and what isn't coming. That's the job. But,
I was thinking, Tom, are we looking anyhow at having an extra meeting so that we can look at the Oxfordshire 2050? Strategy?
Yes, although I wouldn't I'd perhaps not want too many more items if it's going to be.
I think it's a one-item meeting. Yes, I think it would be foolish to put anything with it, because whatever came with it would be underplayed, wouldn't it? Yeah, but I don't think we can manage more than 2 meetings in a month, frankly.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I agree about that. Absolutely, that's the top mark.
So we'll do the best we can, but I think the emergency meeting has just got to be Oxfordshire 2050. And if it turns out that we decide that we can't look at Oxfordshire 2050 because it's still inchoate, I think I can say that now that the officers aren't here, then we might be able to use that meeting for looking at some of this stuff, so we don't have to stick it all into one agenda, because that's really it's quite stressful having a 3-hour meeting, actually. and the stuff at the end tends to, inevitably tends to be skirted over. Yeah, okay, fine. So work plan and forward plan. You've taken that away, Tom, haven't you?
Yes, I'll take that away and sort of prioritise based on having an extra meeting.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Next thing is reports for approval. James Budget Review Group report. Can I hand this over to you?
And I've been waiting all this time just to report on this. I thought we should have had a separate meeting.
Yes.
And it's over 2.5 hours sitting here. I could do a quick summary, but honestly, we're going to have the budget council meeting and everything. I mean, honestly, do you want me to summarize it, or shall we just assume that you look at what's been drafted by Tom?
I think we've all read the report by now, and I am sorry about your waiting. It was difficult to know how to work this evening, and I hadn't realised that we'd spend so long over Oxfordshire 2050, but so apologies.
I would like to support Councillor Fry's recommendation, and also to say I thought it was extremely elegantly written. It was a very thoughtful piece of work about the economy and the different forces at play and so on and so forth. And I'm sure I sense, James, you had some input into that, and so thank you very much.
And but Tom deserves a hell of a lot of praise.
Yeah,
As very,
very cogent and very nuanced in a very clever way. And I mean, I'd have been proud to have written that. Thank you. So
well, thank you.
So, and I thought the recommendations all made sense to me. I didn't have any problem.
Fine.
Thank
So
you.
it'll be submitted to Cabinet on next Tuesday, I suppose, won't it? Right. Tom, Climate Emergency Review Group update. You were slightly concerned about the tone.
That's right. I was a little worried whether I'd been a bit too forthright in the tone for the report on the Climate Emergency Review Group stuff, particularly in regards to the disability inclusivity stuff. I did have a word with Marie Tidball because I knew she wasn't going to be at this meeting, and she gave me some alternative words. I'll just share my screen so that you can see what she's suggested as changes. Give you a moment to read that.
Okay.
Yep.
Are you happy with those changes?
Yes, I think the first one is much more, to use Nigel's word, nuanced than the original way in which it was phrased, and that's fine. And 11 and 12, those two paragraphs seem fine to me.
Cool. Okay, that's fine then. And the rest of the report, were you happy that sort of summarised your views?
Yes.
Yep. Brilliant. And then there is also the procurement update report. I had a chat with Imogen, who's no longer on the call. She did want to put a recommendation together, but is not feeling particularly well at the moment. So the suggestion is that we defer consideration of that till next month. There's no time pressure for it, and in that month she'll hopefully be able to give me a steer as to the additional recommendation she was going to make, and then we can sign it off next month if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. What does everybody think? Everybody happy?
Yeah.
I didn't want to push Imogen if she's not well. It's not okay. Right, so on to item 8, report back. James, Finance and Performance Panel, you may feel the same as you did about the Budget Review Group report, that you don't need to add anything, but feel free to add.
I think it was, Chair, just a signing off of the budget review. So, yeah,
okay,
nothing else to add, probably.
That was it, yes, correct.
Okay, thank you. Right, dates of future meetings. We have a virtual meeting on the 7th of March, if we wish it to continue to be virtual. At the moment, it's down as virtual, and the 5th of April is in person, because hopefully we'll be out of the woods with COVID by then. I like my optimism, but is the 7th of March, are people happy for that to be virtual, or would you like to go back to, yeah, you'd like it virtual, Dick? I don't know what others feel.
Yeah, I'm happy with it virtual.
Okay, fine. Well, let's leave that as virtual. And when you've got a couple of possible dates for the emergency meeting, if we can call it that, if you can just circulate us, Tom, with those.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. I think we're there, aren't we? Is there anything else?
We've just also, the 5th of April currently is scheduled to go back to being in person. Is that what people want, or are you wanting them to retain it as virtual, because that would take us to the end of the civic year?
I mean, I prefer meetings in person because I just think it works better.
I think we've got to break out of this this log jam about virtual. Personally, I think we need to get back to meeting around the table. So I'm happy with March, but perhaps if there was an extraordinary meeting in March as well, we might make that in person. I mean, the council's meeting in person now. I mean, we met last night in person, and I just thought the quality debate was much better. So I think it's harder to chair it and harder to, to shape it all virtually. So I think it's easier for the chair and the vice chair if people are in the same room, frankly.
Okay, so 5th of April in person. Lovely.
Yeah, and possibly the emergency meeting in person as well, if we can find a space. Okay.
Sure.
Lovely, thank you.
Lovely, I think that's it, Chair.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for your patience. It's
No, thank you very much. It was an important conversation. There's a lot more to do, though. I mean, it's just in that early stage, isn't it now?
Yeah.
Inchoate was the phrase you use. It is quite inchoate.